case-based group discussion for the day, the topic being acute onset fever and altered sensorium. And it is my immense honor to introduce the moderator for today's case-based group discussion, Professor Rohit Bhatia sir, currently working as professor in Department of Neurology at AIIMS New Delhi. He is president of Indian Stroke Association. He has been involved in Index TB guidelines, has received several awards and honors. He has published more than 200 original articles and more than 30 book chapters. So, sir will be moderating this case-based group discussion in which there will be two cases which will be presented by our respected faculties from AIIMS New Delhi. Dr. Rajesh Kumar Singh, sir, who has just presented a wonderful presentation on neurocysticercosis, and another one by Dr. Animesh Das, sir, who is assistant professor in Department of Neurology at AIIMS New Delhi. And sir has published at least 18 articles in national and international index journals, and he is a renowned member of Indian Academy of Neurology and Movement Disorder Society. His keen areas of interest being in movement disorders and neurophysiology and of course neuroimmunology. So our presenters will be interacting with our four brilliant senior residents from both the institutes. Dr. Manish Shakivar sir, 6th semester senior resident from Department of Neurology, AIIMS. Dr. Mukesh Kumar sir, 6th semester senior resident from Department of Neurology, AIIMS. Dr. Meena Lanjivar, who is 6th semester senior resident from Department of Neurology at AIIMS, and Dr. Vikas Lakhanpal, 5th semester senior resident from Department of Neurology, PGIMR, Chandigarh. So, handing over to you, sir, Professor Rohit Bhatia, sir, now to for further proceedings.
Thank you, Priyanka. I guess it brings us to a very important topic for discussion today evening, and I think fever with altered sensorium is something we all come across very routinely in the emergency, where the approaches sometimes are generalized to treat the patient emergently and then slowly become more focal and specific as the evaluation brings us closer to the diagnosis. And to discuss these two cases, I have my two close friends and colleagues from the department. Without wasting much time, I would invite Dr. Animesh to present his interesting case. I would want all these residents who are a part of the group discussion to kindly on their videos. They can keep their mics muted. And when Animesh brings in the discussion, please kindly involve yourself actively in the discussion, because this is all about learning and teaching each other. So Animesh, all to you, and all the best for your presentation. There was a 30-minute slot, but I guess because of the want of time, maybe if you can curtail to about 25 minutes, it may be better. But we can see if it is too interesting, we may even go on for another half an hour. So all the best to you.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you. Good evening to one and all. I will start sharing my screen. Am I visible now, sir?
Yes, you're visible.
Yes, sir. Okay. Good evening, my dear senior residents and respected Rohit sir. Thank you for giving me the opportunity for presenting in this platform. I will start straight on with my case because of the time constraints. I will try to complete as Rohit sir said within 20 to 25 minutes, and then keep 5 minutes for the discussion part. So I have these two cases only. So I will go through the cases. I will try to explain everything, and I will try to see how we approach a case of febrile encephalopathy. So coming to this case, this is a case during my DM residency, which I had seen in PGI. So I am presenting this case. This is a 8-year-old girl. She was admitted with complaints of basically fever, headache, petechial and generalized body aches for the last 3 days. This was the acute onset fever, and for the last 3 days only, she was symptomatic. She had this acute history of also restlessness and altered sensorium on the day of admission, with one episode of seizure just prior to the hospital admission. Coming to the short examination, on examination she had petechial rashes all over. On general physical examination she also had hepatosplenomegaly. On GCS examination she was mostly M5, but occasional M6 we could find. She was E3, M6, and V4. There were no meningeal signs. On examination, we could find she had mild left hemiparesis with left UM facial pulses. Sensory and cerebral examination were not reliable, as was only occasional M6. And she was highly analysis of the history. We had acute onset fever, petechial rash, and body ache. This combination, acute onset fever, petechial rash, and body ache, we already know it's a systemic disease. Now whenever we see a case of acute febrile encephalopathy, we will try to divide the cases into two groups, whether it has any systemic symptoms, whether it has no systemic symptoms. Coming to the basically that will help our help in our management issues also. So acute onset fever, petechial rash, and body ache. This means that there is a systemic disease. Mostly we see this combination in viruses like EBV, enterovirus, dengue, chikungunya. In bacterial origin cases, we see in cases of scrub, typhus, in meningococcus, salmonella typhi, and bacterial endocarditis. Whereas in non-infectious cases, in children we have this Kawasaki disease, drug reaction, or SLE, or acute presentation of SLE, rheumatoid arthritis, following some prodromal illness of fever. So coming to the localization, acute decline in sensorium is localized to either disruption of the ascending reticular activating system, which you all know starts from the brainstem to the thalamus, and then the whole ascending reticular system ascends to the cortex or the hello. I'm audible, no?
Yeah, continue on.
Yeah. And either to acute onset decline in sensorium, we localize either to the disruption of ascending reticular system or to the impairment of bilateral cortices. Seeing the child had also left hemiparesis, left hemiparesis not so dense, we localize the lesion to the right coronal radiatal lesion. Then we will see seeing the acute febrile encephalopathy, we will see there are both neurological causes, which can be structural or non, which are generally non-structural. Seeing the patient has left hemiparesis, we localize the patient to the structural lesion only. So yeah.
Maybe you can just try and take the perspective of the residents as well by just bringing in some queries to them.
Okay, sir. I will come to the following slide. I will involve the residents in the following slides, sir.
Yes.
Okay, fine, sir. Thank you. Coming to the hello.
Yes, sir.
Coming to the definition of acute febrile encephalopathy, this is basically a viewpoint given in this article, given in this approach to a case of acute febrile encephalopathy from Garg et al. From Medicare GMC. Acute febrile encephalopathy is defined as the fever less than equal to 7 days of duration with altered sensorium. We have this girl of 3 days duration of fever with altered sensorium along with other symptoms. So this child fits into the first day. And encephalopathy should start either at the onset of the fever or following fever. She also fits into the second point also, and this lasting for at least 24 hours. This girl already had symptoms for the last 3 days. So this girl fits into a classic case of acute febrile encephalopathy. Now, coming to the causes of acute febrile encephalopathy, there is a huge list of acute febrile encephalopathy causes. We basically will divide the causes into the either infective cause or the non-infective cause. Infective causes can be encephalitis or meningitis or cerebral malaria, abscess, sepsis-associated encephalopathy, sepsis with DIC, and TTP. These are all the infective causes of an acute febrile encephalopathy. Coming to the non-infectious cause, we have this overproduction, either this overproduction of heat or the impaired heat dissipation or the structural lesions or there are miscellaneous. So in overproduction of heat, we in a tertiary care center will definitely come across a case of either NMS or serotonin syndrome. These are patient typical for tertiary care centers. We will see the salicylate poisoning in periphery. If someone has done MBBS or MD from periphery medical college, we can see cocaine toxicity and salicylate toxicity. Thyrotoxic encephalopathy we will see in tertiary care center mostly. In impaired heat distribution, we will not see such cases, but in this center, in our audience, but it may show in some periphery medical college of this anticholinergic toxicity also, and heat stroke cases. Some structural lesions which also can cause acute febrile encephalopathy. There are hypothalamic lesions, or some brainstem stroke like point-time hemorrhage, or IV or subarachnoid hemorrhage can also present with symptoms of fever and acute encephalopathy. So that might be a cause for acute febrile encephalopathy also. Other causes of acute febrile encephalopathy which are miscellaneous are ADM, cerebral fat embolism, or altered sensorium with some secondary cause, or it's the umbrella otherwise of CNS vasculitis, which can be secondary to some infection, or the primary CNS vasculitis, or mitochondrial disease and metabolic. So how to approach a case of acute febrile encephalopathy? First, we will see whether it is acute febrile encephalopathy or not. Whether it is acute febrile encephalopathy, we will see that by the three definitions, it should be fever less than equal to 7 days, fever less than equal to 7 days, or the altered sensorium associated with fever, and that should be persist for 24 hours. So if the case fits into the definition of acute febrile encephalopathy, we will see the history, whether there are some specific points of history in history, like age, sex, travel history, or the season history. Like travel history is if somebody has gone to some Himalayan, travel to some Himalayan country, state like Himachal Pradesh, mostly the cachexia will come into the picture. If in seasonal history, we know mumps and measles are mostly mostly come in the spring season, while influenza come in the winter season. Or the past history of acute febrile encephalopathy, that means whether the patient has repeated episodes of acute febrile encephalopathy, some metabolic cause. We can see some diagnostic clues on examination, like whether there are in general examination, we can see rashes. It can be present in mumps, measles, and scrub typhus. In petechial, rashes we can see in sepsis, dengue, malaria. Injection scar we can see in that might give a clue of the immunocompromised state of the patient. The patient might be a drug addict, and he may have a concomitant HIV infection, or the patient, if the patient is icterus, we can suspect the patient can have malaria, leptospira, or Reye's syndrome. Or if the patient has symptoms of lymphadenopathy, we can have this lymphoma. But we can think of this lymphoma part. Coming to neurological examination, if the patient has meningeal signs, we can obviously think of the meningitis, encephalitis, or the subarachnoid hemorrhage. These ICP signs, we should obviously think of something, a brain lesion. Focal deficit will localize a specific cerebral hemisphere if it is there. Dystonia and rigidity we can obviously see in cases of Japanese encephalitis, and give us an idea if the patient has Hashimoto's encephalitis or serotonin syndrome. If the patient has autonomic dysfunction, we can obviously look for causes like NMS, serotonin syndrome, or HSV encephalitis when it affects the insula and the basifrontal lobe. If we look at the eyes, there can be gaze paresis to either side. There can be false localizing sign of sixth nerve palsy, or the brainstem. There can be brainstem lesion causing this eye paresis, and PPR, basically involvement of the PPR. We can see opsoclonus in Japanese encephalitis. We can look for nystagmus in seizure in non-convulsive status epilepticus, subtle nystagmus, or the drug overdose like in phenytoin toxicity. We can have, or in anticholinergic toxicity, we can have the nystagmus, or there can be cases of ocular bobbing in pontine lesion. In fundus, we can see for evidence of subacute bacterial endocarditis, or there can be tuberculosis sitting there right there in the fundus. So coming to after the history and the examination, the case to either a CNS versus extra CNS. If the CNS, if we localize a case to CNS, then we can obviously go for the cardinal investigation we do in CNS, like MRI brain with contrast with and the CSF examination, and along with the EEG. If there are extra CNS manifestation also, like in this case, there are petechial lesions are there. And the patient also has a history of myalgia, so we can look for the surrogate markers like liver parameters like SGOT, SGPT elevation, or the creatine phosphokinase elevation, that might give an idea about the systemic infection or the TLC count. That might give us a clue that the case may be somewhat like a dengue or scrub typhus or Japanese encephalitis, which are dengue or scrub typhus, basically all leptospiral, which might have other extra CNS manifestation. If there are only primary CNS manifestation, then we will look forward to infective cause as a case of herpes simplex encephalitis, or look forward to more CNS related infections like herpes simplex encephalitis or Japanese encephalitis. We'll obviously evaluate the blood and CSF parameters. Like we look for the blood culture. Okay, most of the bacterial meningitis in 30 to 40% cases can have blood culture positivity, whereas we look for the parameters of CSF to whether there are evidence of bacterial meningitis or fungal meningitis or viral meningitis, etc. And we will look for the features on imaging also. We'll institute appropriate treatment. We'll basically, Rohit said in the beginning of this talk only, we can start primarily empiric treatment, and basically as we go down the line, as we have more and more investigation, we can become more specific depending on as the investigation comes, as the investigative parameters comes, as the results of the investigative parameters comes. And if even after doing all these things, even after giving the empiric therapy, and even all the parameters like blood culture come negative, CSF parameters come negative, imaging parameters come negative, and we don't get a clue, then we should think, are we missing something? Are we missing a case of metabolic disease, like these are more common in childhood, like organic acidemias or fatty acid oxidation disorders, or we will obviously look for other cases of CNS vasculitis, which is basically umbrella diagnosis or new onset refractory status epilepticus. Are we missing something which might be normal in all other in our CSF, MRI, and routine imaging? So in blood investigation, to recommended investigations in a case of acute febrile encephalopathy or blood investigations, it's taken from the article of Dr. Manish Modi sir. So we will look for the blood investigations in routine hemogram, also in routine hemogram, blood culture, and peripheral smear. In routine hemogram, we will look for the cases, we will look for either the relative lymphocytosis. Relative lymphocytosis will primarily tell us either we are dealing with a malignancy viral disorder, in which the relative lymphocytosis is more common, or it can be also be a case of typhoid encephalopathy, also in which relative lymphocytosis is common. Leukopenia and thrombocytopenia will tell us that the case may be we may be primarily dealing with the case of rickettsia or dengue. In both these cases, we see the leukopenia and thrombocytopenia in blood investigation. In fact, leukopenia precedes thrombocytopenia by about 1 to 3 days, and that settles as the dengue part settles. Blood culture, as I have already told, the blood culture can be positive in 30 to 40% cases of acute bacterial meningitis, and we will also look for the peripheral blood smear, both the thin and thick slides, for the obviously cases of for gametocytes of Plasmodium. That can be both Vivax and Falciparum. Then we'll do the lumbar puncture. Then, as I have already told, depending on the lumbar puncture picture, we can get an idea whether that is viral or tubercular or bacterial, and whether it is fungal or some malignancy is sitting right there. And then we will do the cases of neuroimaging. In neuroimaging, all these investigations and imaging will go hand in hand. We can do a case, we can do EEG in a particular case to look for evidence of herpes simplex encephalitis in cases where neuroimaging is taking time. In cases we can also do in particular cases we can also do a chest X-ray, particularly in this COVID era. In selected cases, thyrotoxic encephalopathy can also present like acute febrile encephalopathy. So in selected cases, we can do thyroid function test, drug levels in cases of cocaine toxicity, cocaine or salicylate toxicity, if we suspect SARS case, and urine toxicology skin, obviously in cases of drug addicts. This is one of the papers from KGMC in which they have looked for the about 120 adult patients of acute febrile encephalopathy, and they have found out that pyogenic meningitis constituted most of the features, most of the cases, followed by acute viral meningoencephalitis, in which the Japanese encephalitis, HSV encephalitis. Japanese encephalitis constituted the predominant part, followed by HSV encephalitis and other viral etiology not identified within rest of the cases. This pyogenic meningitis followed by acute viral meningitis, followed by cerebral malaria, and then followed by sepsis-associated encephalopathy, enteric encephalopathy, and tuberculous meningitis. Yes, that was the spectrum of acute febrile encephalopathy which they have found in a prospective case control study, in a prospective observational study. Now, coming to the MRI images of this patient, already had, as I will try to tell, that fever, headache, altered sensorium, followed by on examination one episode. On history, he had one episode of seizure, followed by on examination. This is empirical. That's hepatosplenomegaly. MRI image. This is the T1 weighted image of this patient. Can the resident Dr. Meena tell what is MRI showing? Dr. Meena, are you audible? Am I audible?
Yeah. So am I audible?
Yeah. You can describe the MRI.
So there is a ring enhancing lesion. And
No, it's a T1 plain.
It's a T1
plain
image. T1
yeah.
image with a ring enhancing lesion, and the perilesion, extensive perilesion is there, sir. And
I am telling it's a T1 plain image, so no contrast is being given. So if we see a white T1 hyperintense lesion, what all we should think? It's a T1 weighted image. It's plain T1, not with contrast. So what are the things that come white on plain T1?
So either it is a calcified ring.
Calcified ring. Have you seen any cases of such acute presentation with calcified ring? It might be more common thing we see in strokes also.
Sorry, sir.
I want to describe.
Manish, tell me.
This is a T1 weighted image. We show the hypo-intense center with the enhancing capsule with the.
I am telling it's plain T1. Manish.
It's a hypo-intense core with the hyper-intense rim, actually with a disproportional hypo-intensity around this hyper-intense rim, maybe the edema.
Manish, look at carefully the extent of the entire lesion.
Yes, sir.
And then talk about the part which Animesh is pointing to. First, look at the entirety of the right frontal lobe carefully. And part of that area within that shows hyper intensity, which is ring-like, and that is T1 plane. He has repeatedly told you that.
Yes, sir.
So Manish, tell me what are the lesion? What are the things which look bright on plain T1? I think you might know by now.
And there is another focal speck of hyper intensity.
Focal hyper intensity also there in the right frontal lobe. Maybe, sir, evolving abscess in which there is a central hypointense with the rim.
No. Just we'll go back to the basics only. Tell me the things which come bright on T1, plain T1. Then we'll analyze this lesion.
What is the differential diagnosis of hyperintense T1 weighted image? That is the question. What is bright on T1? Anyone else would like to say? Dr. Mukesh? Dr. Vikas?
Minerals.
Which mineral?
Calcium, melanin, presence of melanin. And
melanin is one thing. Calcium does not look bright on T1.
No.
the melanin is one thing. Others are more common. You see in cases of subacute hemorrhage, no, subacute
But, yes,
cases of
yes.
hematoma. So why are you people not coming up? So in bride, in my opinion, maybe Dwight sir will be, have seen more cases. In my opinion, there are only three things which commonly we see in plain T1, which may come bride. So these are subacute hematoma. Second is residual melanin, as you have already told, and third is contrast. So melanin, contrast, and subacute hematoma are the only three things commonly we see which may come bright on T1. So coming to the
Yes,
T2 images, we have seen it's a T2 hypo followed by surrounding T2 hyper lesion. This is basically the surrounding edema. So coming to the GR images, it's a whole blooming is there on this lesion, along with there are other specks of blooming coming on the right frontal and the left frontal also, and there is also one blooming in the in the intraventricular region.
I would just like to add an image for the students that fat is bright as well. And
Yes,
if you
sir.
have a very highly proteinaceous content, especially in tumors or in secretory lesions, they would also have brightness on T1. So, and any paramagnetic substance, of course, gadolinium when you give for contrast. And as Animesh has already pointed out, blood, which we commonly see in the subacute phase, that would be. So always think of fat, blood, always think of protein rich substances, and you would be seeing that in some tumors in the brain that they may be paradoxically bright on T1 as well. So that is a bit of an addition to what Animesh said.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So coming to all these lesions, these are basically bloom lesions. These are basically hemorrhage surrounded by edema. These all lesions coming from the T1, T2, and GRE images. We obviously see it's a basically bleed surrounding by the regional edema. So coming to the obviously the next will be we have to rule out hemorrhagic infarct. So then I am giving you the MR genography also is normal by and large normal. So in we will go to the FLAIR image also. There was a midline shift of around 4.2 mm. So coming to this infect case, basically the imaging differentials on the infective cause. On the coming to the since we have already said it's a fever with petechial rash, we will coming to the we will have imaging differentials of this case only. So hemorrhagic encephalitis, basically in a case of hemorrhagic encephalitis in an infective cause, we will think of basically this viruses. The dengue will be the most common, followed by HSV1, followed by HSV1. Second will be varicella zoster. Influenza lesions, influenza hemorrhagic encephalitis have been described in childhood cases of febrile encephalopathy. Cerebral malaria may cause this hemorrhagic lesions, hemorrhagic encephalitis lesions. HHV 6 and 7 has been described in children. EVV, enterovirus, and obviously now it's the era of COVID-19. So this is the image described just month ago in radiology. It's a COVID acute hemorrhagic necrotizing encephalomyelitis they have described. So they have described this blooming in this.
Animesh, could you ask them what would be the other differential of this kind of lesion in non-COVID era?
Yes, sir.
Manish, could you tell one of the differentials from Indian subcontinent when you have these deep basal thalamic lesions with blooming and hemorrhages? Let's say it was not a COVID patient. Pardon?
Japanese encephalitis could involve thalamus and the.
Yes. So if you see such kind of a lesion, just be aware in our country that it could be still be a Japanese, especially with thalamic involvement and some micro hemorrhages, because that's not uncommon as well.
Yes, sir. And that in cases of non-infective cases, in imaging differentials, we will come to the acute hemorrhagic leukoencephalopathy. That is a childhood variant of, we can basically say, fulminant variety of ADM, which is called Western can also have this demyelinating type of lesions, white fluffy shadows, along with multiple hemorrhages. In fact, CNS vascularitis, obviously, I'm telling it as it's a basket of diagnosis. We don't know whether it is primary. It can be both primary CNS vasculitis or secondary to some systemic vasculitis. That obviously in other differentials can be primary vein tumor or metastasis. So investigations in our case, we found out basically, I have already told you, just look at the history, just look at the examination. So examination, we found petechial lesions and hepatosplenomegaly. On examination, in routine examination of hematochemistry which you sent, we found out that the TLC was 2400 and the initial platelet count was 50,000. So mostly it will go into the case of either dengue encephalitis or rickettsial encephalitis or strep type encephalitis, because in these two cases mostly this part of northern India we get this TLC and TLC count decrease along with platelet count decrease along with this hemorrhagic lesions. This TLC count gradually improved along the course of the disease from 2,400, 4,500, 6,800, 7,200. The platelet count also significantly improved. Blood chemistry and blood gas analysis were normal. And serological test, we had positive dengue IgM antibodies that were repeated twice. We had this also negative for serological test, were also negative for JE and chikungunya, negative for malarial parasite and CAR test, and both CAR test and smear were negative. We deferred the CSF analysis in view of the 4.2 mm midline shift, and we also did the EG as a part of the routine work, because we see in cases of acute febrile encephalopathy, unless there are contraindications, we will go for the CSF analysis, EEG and the MRI from the neuro investigation part of view, along with other systemic investigations, as I have already. Supportive treatment in Indian epileptics, her vital remained throughout the hospital stay and discharged on day 14 of hospital stay with the final diagnosis of dengue encephalopathy. So I don't have the repeat imaging, I don't have the follow-up, but my colleagues who are following up in PGI Lucknow, this girl has followed up after 6 months and she is perfectly all right. They have done a repeat imaging that have also showed the decline and the resolution of the bleed also. So neurological complications, we don't see such type of patients in AIIMS, because it's the dengue. Basically, we see that in spite of this dengue endemic areas, we don't get this type of patients in AIIMS. Neurological complications in dengue that can be divided either in the diffuse CNS involvement or neuromuscular complications or neuro-ophthalmic involvement. I will go only to the dengue encephalopathy and the dengue encephalitis. That dengue encephalopathy, I will try to define.
Dr. Animesh, you'll have to wrap up. Dr. Animesh, you'll have to wrap up fast because we are much before. Yeah, please, a couple of minutes.
Sir. Okay, sir, fine. So coming to the dengue, the difference between dengue encephalopathy and dengue encephalitis was that basically we have this in dengue encephalitis, we'll have the dengue IgM positive in the CSF along with CSF pleocytosis, whereas it will not be there in dengue encephalopathy. Dengue encephalopathy can have this brain hemorrhage, as I have shown in this slide. So mostly it was a case of dengue encephalopathy. There was a division of the criteria of dengue encephalitis. They have attempted division. They have shown cases even if we don't do CSF, we can label it as a case of acute dengue encephalitis based on the reactive IgM dengue, either antibody or NS1 antigen or dengue PCR on serum also if there are other signs. This was published just after the Lancet paper. I will not go into the details of the second. Basically, the second case was a case of post-dengue ADM. So I will, that is a post-dengue immunological phenomena. So I will just go through the slides. It's our case only. When I just joined here as a faculty, this case came in our in our unit. So it was basically demyelinating lesions following post-dengue. After 3 days of post-dengue, the patient came here and the patient has progressive hemiparesis, progressive right hemiparesis. We treated the flare lesions are typical of demyelinating lesions. The AD diffusion weighted images and ADC images, as we all know, some demyelinating lesions can have this diffusion restriction. The dengue IgM came positive, so we treated this patient with already this patient received 5 doses of methylprednisolone from outside. We treated the patient with plasmapheresis and were discharged after a diagnosis of day 14 of hospital stay with a diagnosis of dengue. We did the MRI brain after 5 months of the insult. We can show nice resolution of the lesions. So I will not go into the details. So the take-home message for this case for my presentation would be empiric. In a case of acute febrile encephalopathy, we start the patient on empiric antibiotics and antivirals and corticosteroids after ruling out other infectious etiology. Dengue can have a wide variety of CNS manifestation due to direct viral infection like dengue encephalitis or dengue encephalopathy, or immunologic phenomena like post-dengue ADM. It is a rare case of encephalopathy even in this endemic areas of North India. And dengue encephalitis can also be diagnosed with serum antigen antibody positivity in appropriate clinical contrast. So I have this interesting MRI in a case of this is not typically a case of acute febrile encephalopathy, but I just wanted to show the hemorrhage part. This was a patient, 23 years old, 22 weeks pregnant female. This patient is currently now admitted with ICU 5. She is a 23 years old female with 2-month history of on and off fever with axillary lymphadenopathy. This is the lesion we see on MRI on flare imaging. Can anybody describe the MRI? Manish.
Sir, it is a flare image history of the hyper intense lesion involving the multifocal lesion, actually, sir. We involving only the white matter more than as compared to gray matter. Left side parieto occipital mainly, and bilateral medial frontal lobe also involved.
Bilateral medial frontal lobe, I am not sure of that part. Bilateral basifrontal hyperintensity
medial frontal
there, huh?
And,
other thing, tell me the other things. We have seen the causes of infective causes of hemorrhagic encephalitis in that slide.
Yes, sir.
Most common viruses which called infective hemorrhagic encephalitis. Basically, it's a hemorrhagic encephalitis.
Herpes simplex and the varicella zoster are most.
So we know that I wanted to tell you that this was the MRI sequences of diffusion weighted lesion basifrontal area of infarct, along with there were these multiple areas of blooming. So this case was reported as a case of CNS vasculitis in view of the two. In these cases were reported by a neurology department as a case of suspected vasculitis in view of the multiple areas of infarct and bleed, not following a territorial pattern, secondary to some infection in view of the hydrocephalus. Secondary, we see the nice hydrocephalus here. Secondary to the hydrocephalus. On CSF examination, we did the CSF examination, and this lady came out to be rifampicin resistant. Gene expert, it was rifampicin resistant tuberculosis. This case is admitted with us currently right now. So it's next one is a simple one. It's a 44 years old female, fever for 4 days, altered sensorium for 3 days. On examination, neck vegetative was present. Can you describe the MRI? And it's a spotter only. Fever from 4 days, altered sensorium 3 days. It's a spotter. Tell me.
Herpes simplex or ordering.
Yeah, herpes simplex. So it's basically a typical case of herpes simplex. Is there any role of steroids?
No, sir.
Are there any randomized controlled trials? So one randomized controlled trial was there in herpes simplex. In cases of herpes simplex encephalitis, they have this 2007 to 2012, they are initially planned to recruit around 385 patients, but in that 5 years they could recruit only 41 patients. So even after 41 patients, they are given acyclovir plus dexamethasone or acyclovir plus methylprednisolone or acyclovir alone. They have shown in 41 patient there was no improvement in the group receiving acyclovir plus steroids. So methylprednisolone had no role in herpes simplex encephalitis. So I will stop my slide sharing here.
Thank you, Animesh, for the lucid and detailed presentation. Unfortunately, because of the lack of time, we need to move on to the second case. We're already few minutes, in fact, 15 minutes post the planned schedule. So I would invite Dr. Rajesh, kindly present your case, and would be happy if you could invite the residents to participate for your queries, and then take up the case as it has evolved and been managed by you. So
Good evening, sir. And okay, I will try to involve resident as much as possible. So I'm just sharing my slide. Yes. So Dr. Animesh has presented acute febrile encephalopathy. I will take the liberty here. I am presenting some case of subacute, having subacute presentation. So this is a 20-year lady presented with history of fever, headache, and vomiting for 12 days. And she has 3 episodes of seizure, and followed by encephalopathy for last 5 days. And from the same duration, she also reported quadriparesis and with lower limb more than upper limb, with bladder bowel involvement for the last 5 days. So there was no significant past history. So presented with raised fever with headache, vomiting, seizures, encephalopathy, and quadriparesis with bladder bowel involvement. On examination, she has tachycardia with normal blood pressure, and she has pallor, and has some macropapillary rash on the face and palm. Rest of the examination systemic examination were normal, and meningeal signs was present. Neck was reduced, Kernig sign was also present. She was conscious but disoriented, and there was pupillary, no pupillary asymmetry. On tone, there was decreased tone in both the lower limbs. And power-wise, upper limb is 3/5, lower limb was 0/5. Sensory, after her sensorium improved, it was sensory was decreased below C4 level, and reflexes were brisk in the upper limb and 1+ in the lower limbs, and plantar was extensor. So, Manish, can you tell? Can you localize?
Probably it encephalopathy along with the cervical cord involvement leading to the quadriparesis. In the history of the 12 days, maybe subacute onset, I would like to keep the most common possibility that TBM along with TB myelitis.
Okay, it is one possibility. First, we should localize yes, it is meningoencephalitis, because the patient has history of fever, headache, and vomiting with seizure and encephalopathy. So it is, and on examination, you found there was meningeal signs. So it is a case of meningoencephalitis, subacute onset with probably cord involvement. But on examination, there was some lower limb, the tone was decreased, and also the reflexes were decreased, and it was brisk in the upper limbs. So any other possibility besides, can we be more precise? Yes, I agreed, it is meningoencephalitis with probably myelitis with cause of decrease.
It can be tubercular arachnoiditis also, sir.
Okay, so one etiology is tubercular. We also thought the same way, but any other possibility?
So ADM can be a possibility.
Okay, ADM can progress up to 2 weeks or even more. So ADM, okay.
With the possibility because of involvement of bladder bowel and.
So ADM can cause myelitis.
Moog encephalomyelitis can be the possibility, sir, because of bladder bubble involvement also prominent and early.
So meningeal sign will be slightly odd in the case of edem, but yes, it is definitely a possibility. So
Component of meningoencephalitis followed by a seizure, and she's been like that since past 5 days. So a possibility of NCSE status also can be there.
But she was almost conscious. She was slightly dosy oriented. She was M6. So
it can be a possibility of tubercular meningoencephalitis with tubercular myeloarachnoiditis.
Yes, we kept it as even the first possibility. So
Fungal myelitis.
Fungal. Yes,
fungal can be the possibility, sir.
Yes, it can be the possibility. So basically, it is we localize to meningoencephalitis with quadriparesis UMN with decreased reflexes lower limb, which can be due to myeloradiculopathy, arachnoiditis, and even the spinal shock, which if it starts some asymmetry can be found. So based on this, the differential diagnosis, all of you are pointing towards first differential diagnosis will be tubercular meningitis, few edem, and if any other possibilities.
So autoimmune can be the etiology because she is a young patient having anemia and the rash is facial and as well as the
Very good. Yes, there are 2 pointers. The anemia was there, and she has some rash over the face and hands, maculopapular rash. So one possibility is autoimmune. In autoimmune condition, what do you want to keep it or?
Meena, if you have a patient with fever and altered sensorium, and as Dr. Rajesh is giving a pointer that there are features of meningitis, and meninges run from your brain to your spine downwards, entire up to your sacral roots, and you also have a rash, then would you think of an infective cause or an autoimmune cause in pragmatic approach?
So it is basically the first, the infective is the first.
So think about causes.
Yes, which cause rash? Yes, sir, rightly said. The viral
things should be thought
of. Definitely, the infectious cause they will be
should be on the upper end. Yes.
Yeah.
And in the presence of rash, the cause of rash can be anything. Can be drug, but can be any viral illness. So
SLE encephalomyelitis.
Yeah. Okay. We will keep it lower down right now, but yes, it can be a possibility. But
yes,
how many cases have you seen?
Dr. Manish, you are keeping very high-profile diagnosis. I mean, what would you do?
We should proceed further. Let us proceed further, sir.
The possibilities which you would normally do as an emergency physician, as an emergency neurologist in a tropical country.
So, okay.
Yes, infective definitely I would like to give the first possibility, but after ruling out the infection, autoimmune
that's
could
fine. Your investigations, as Dr. Rajesh is going to allude to, will run in parallel, but your approach has to be more
infective first. Yes. So, though infective, we will consider bacterial. Yes, the tuberculosis, as rightly said, can present with like that. Other rare bacterial infection, if we are suspecting myeloradiculopathy, we should also consider, besides viral, even cytomegalovirus or something like that. Then demyelinating inflammatory autoimmune condition, we should also keep in mind, but it will be definitely in the lower round. The drug, because of the drug-induced, we should also keep, and the neoplastic we will not. We will very lower down. So imaging. This is the imaging MRI brain. This is T1. This is T1 contrast. Can you able to pick something? Any resident? So in this MRI, there is no definite meningeal enhancement, but you can see here there is some focal meningeal thickening. Here it is present. In the FLAIR image, you can see the cingulate gyrus showing hyperintensity, and in the pons there is some hyperintensity as was seen. MRI SWI showing no blooming. And the sagittal section showing of the cervical spine showing a long hyperintensity. Cord is swollen, and it is from almost the cervical cord, also involving some pons, and going up to the lower down almost long segment cervical hyperintensity. So, and there is no contrast enhancement, neither in the lower down also, to suggest any arachnoiditis. So, will the still any should we modify our diagnosis? Has imaging helped us? So at least at this stage, the tubercular meningitis, there should have been some more meningeal enhancement, or which is not there. The hyperintensity can be post-ictal also, but not in the brainstem, of course. So we at this stage we were confused. What should be the picture? So we had started the patient on ATT, and right now first let us see the investigations. Yes, so he came with the CSF finding having the 15 cells, and protein was slightly elevated, Suga was 71. We have sent all the infective etiology, and all turn out to be negative.
Rajesh,
Yes, sir.
could these residents point out if you see a basifrontal involvement and then a cord involvement, long segment? Would something come to their mind? What differentials do they come to their mind with this basifrontal involvement?
Yes.
Any specific infection which tends to involve this area, or because this is a flare section, so I'm not sure it is just the white matter in the basifrontal or it is the gray matter as well. Maybe a corneal could have helped, but I mean, any specific suggestion? Do you think it is a white matter involvement, gray matter involvement? It is just a deep centrum semiovale or a basifrontal region?
Actually, it is involving cortex. It is cingulate. It is involving that, sir. And on the contrast, there is some here focal meningeal thickening.
That's an there's a sulcal enhancement.
Otherwise, so any other thing you in the presence of, as sir is pointing out, in the presence of high cervical cord, this involvement and this picture.
So for the basifrontal involvement, herpes sometime involve more temporal as well as the basifrontal area. But after herpes, tuberculosis can also involve the associated with the encephalomyelitis and LETM like picture, and with the background history of 12 days of the illness. Again, possibility tuberculosis should be high.
So okay. Besides, sir, would you like to add something about?
No. I think you continue.
Okay.
Because we lose time.
Okay. Then the rest of the investigation, there was anemia. Rest of the vasculitic profile, viral markers, Coombs test were negative. 24-hour urinary protein was within normal limit. At this ultrasound, on the examination, per abdominal examination, there was no as per se clinically, but yes, there was mild ascites, which was tapeable, and it was showing some transudative nature. And we have also, since it was not typically fitting in the tubercular or CSF findings were also there, and so we proceeded with other NMO and MOG antibodies, which were also negative. But when we have done ANA and anti-dsDNA, it was positive, and it was present in very high titers. So basically, the pointers towards this diagnosis is rash. Although the PC had not any previous history of rash, she may have some constitutional symptoms prior to this, but definitely no long history. Serositis usually in SLE, usually pleuritis and pericarditis is there, but the patient here presented with ascites. Although it shows some systemic involvement, the patient was when improved after the sensorium, she was she presented having psychosis for prolonged period. Even after during the discharge, we have to give medicine for her, is gradually improved. Fever, yes, we have to rule out other. If it is non-infectious, it would be a point towards even non-infectious cause also. So just ACR guidelines for SLE, it has, as you all know, it has been modified now. So the entry criteria for SLE is now ANA positivity, and if ANA is positive in high titers, then we will keep this the clinical criteria and the antibody criteria. It has somehow changed previously. In this, they have included the fever, which is if it is not, but provided it is non-infectious. And after other findings like hematological, neuropsychiatric, and serosal, musculoskeletal, and antibodies. So if the total point exceeds 10, then we will consider for SLE. In this patient, of course, it exceeded 10. So she was initially, we started with him anti-tubercular only with steroids, but on after evaluating all the causes, we stopped ATT finally, and we even repeated CSF, and it was normal cells after a week. And that she was again started on MPS, plasma exchange, and finally cyclophosphamide pulse. And after 4 months of follow-up, she is able to walk independently. She had no systemic symptoms with mild urinary difficulty in the form of urgency and constipation is still she is having. And so the final diagnosis was SLE presenting as aseptic meningitis with myelitis. When we had reviewed the lecture, the myelitis SLE presentation is not very common. So, but yes, many patients can present with myelitis, and aseptic meningitis has also been reported, but not very common. So, can you define aseptic meningitis? Any one of your residents?
Patient presenting with symptom of
aseptic meningitis, can you define?
Patient presenting with clinical features of headache, fever, and neck pain, along in conjunction with CSF findings, which are cells would be lesser on the side, protein may be mildly to moderately elevated, and normal sugar level. And in conjunction with negative AFB and other routine infective causes.
Aseptic meningitis should not be diagnosed primarily because we have to rule out all other causes, because even it should not be, it is a disease of diagnosis of exclusion. So before ruling out, we should rule out all the infectious causes. Yes, the aseptic meningitis, we have to be can present with clinical and lab evidence of meningeal inflammation with negative routine bacterial culture. The most common cause is enterovirus, and all other infections will come under aseptic meningitis only. So the viral causes, the bacterial causes, the fungal causes, parasitic causes, even the common drugs, you should remember ibuprofen or Combiflam, which we commonly use, can cause aseptic meningitis. Even IVIG administration sometimes can cause aseptic meningitis. And in the last but not the least, the autoimmune causes, particularly in young female patients, and if have some systemic features, we should also consider. Take home message: high index of suspicion for inflammatory and autoimmune condition, and aseptic meningitis can be the presentation, and look for clinical clues, and it is rewarding to treat. But before concluding, I must tell that we should not delay treatment. We should start, if required, antibacterial, antitubercular, and if we are confirmed, then only we can stop that treatment for that. In this case also, we have given ATT for a week or so. Sir, anything you want to comment, sir?
No, Rajesh, I think it's a good case. It's a great learning case, both from a clinical approach as well as I told in the beginning, we start with a pragmatic approach to treat patients with fever and altered sensorium, because it's a very, very huge and a very wide differential. But we slowly fine tune it based on history, examination, and our own experiences and managing patients in our own epidemiological setup. But at the same time, as Rajesh said, we must be, and as some of the residents pointed out, that we must have a broad perspective to evaluate. And I think in this patient, the longitudinally extensive myelitis is a great clue that you may be dealing with something more than just an infection. So we must investigate and evaluate these patients for non-infectious causes as well, which could mimic an infection. And as Dr. Rajesh pointed out, we must treat patients with the want of time so that they don't deteriorate. And as we fine tune our evaluation and investigations, we then focus on a more a clear approach and a diagnostic approach. I think the lack of meningeal findings and lack of really typical findings on the imaging and the presence of CSF, which was pointing not to a very core infectious pathology, did and should have raised a concern that we may be dealing with a non-infectious cause as well. But I guess this case brings to the light that we must have index of suspicion of all potential cases, causes of these conditions. So I think that's a great learning case. Rajesh, are you finished with your presentation?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so thank you, Rajesh, for the presentation. And as I think we have some time for question answers, so I would request all the speakers of the current session to kindly join. We have Animesh there. Animesh, are you there?
I am there, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. So there were a few questions. The questions which were actually put forward are the questions which were related mainly to the previous session as well. So Dr. Anu, can we take questions from the previous which are there in the chat box as well, or?
Yes, sir. I think we can start from the beginning. Dr. Anand can take up the questions.
Okay,
right
fine.
from the first talk. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Professor Rohit sir, for moderating the session, and I would also thank presenters, Dr. Animesh sir and Dr. Rajesh sir, as well as the senior residents to participate actively in the case. Sir, as far as the cases are concerned, we don't have a question. So I would ask the questions related to the sessions which we had today. First question I would like to direct to Dr. Vibha ma'am, Dr. Deepti Vibha ma'am. Ma'am, are you there? Hello.
Yes. Go ahead.
Ma'am, the question is, can we clinically differentiate cryptococcal meningitis and tubercular meningitis?
Clinically, you can suspect both. They are a differential of chronic meningitis. So clinically, they would present similarly. They would present with a history of fever, headache, vomiting, altered sensorium, focal neurological deficits. And when we talk about the radiology, cryptococcal meningitis is a great mimicker of even chronic tuberculous meningitis. So there is a problem with my video. It's showing a weird picture. So I think so now it is okay. So yes. So I was there. So even the radiology can be a very close mimicker, in the sense that it can have hydrocephalus, it can have granulomas, which can be present typically in the basal ganglia in the case of cryptococcal meningitis. But nevertheless, you can also see it in tuberculous meningitis. The hallmark is that if you are doing a CSF, you should never forget to do an India Inc. and cryptococcal antigen. Also, if the cryptococcal antigen alone is positive, then there is a possibility that there might be a contamination by blood. So because in that situation, you also have to check the blood cryptococcal antigen titers. So there's a titer ratio, and because in antigen will remain positive. Even when you treat cryptococcal meningitis, antigen is something which will remain positive. So there are situations, in which you will get cryptococcal antigen positive, but India Inc. might be negative. So in that situation, you also have to look at the titers as well as the entire clinical picture, and you have to wait for the India Inc. culture to come. It might be possible that you have missed it in a CSF because the CSF had degenerated, or you waited for a long time. But if your clinical suspicion is there is no harm in repeating a CSF. Second pointer is, as I told in my presentation also, if you're getting repeated high pressures. So typically we know that in cryptococcal meningitis, you might sometimes have to do a weekly CSF, not only to look at repeat India Inc., but also to decrease the CSF pressures, which might be invariably very high in cryptococcal meningitis. Third is, of course, if you're finding it in association with HIV.
So in association with HIV, cryptococcal antigen with a low CD4 count is something in which you should keep the index of suspicion really higher. Anything else? Anybody? Dr. Manish, would you like to add something to that?
It is only the microbiology which will finally cleanse the diagnosis. Clinically it is difficult to differentiate the two. It's a great mimicker. Whenever you think of cryptococcal, it never comes, and it just comes accidentally when you are not really suspecting it.
Yeah. So the case you miss it, the case in which you don't do it, that very case is going to be good. Yeah. So like this case directly to neurosurgery, because this was hydrocephalus and then this patient was COVID positive. It went to the COVID center. It went to the neurosurgeons.
Yeah.
They just put in a shunt. The patient improved. They were all happy. They discharged the patient. And when it came back with deterioration, then was the time that we really looked into the CSF again and we found it was cryptococcal positive.
And the second question is, there is a isolated tuberculoma in MRI. What regimen would you choose, and for how long will you treat the patient?
So if it is clinically and radiologically, there's no doubt in the diagnosis of tuberculoma, you treat it like extrapulmonary tuberculosis. That's the regime. Typically, tuberculoma treatment versus tuberculous meningitis treatment, they are equated in books, but practically there is a lot of deviation which we see, and that is why probably this question is there on board. For an isolated tuberculoma, which is responding nicely clinically as well as on repeated MRI, follow-up MRI, it's not a huge challenge. We see it, and most of the times it is rewarding. The problem comes when there is either an iris or a paradoxical reaction, so the edema increases subsequently, or what happens is that you see that one tuberculoma is resolved but the other tuberculoma is flaring up. So those are the situations where sometimes you need to keep on. We see follow-up patients in whom the tuberculomas are there, and the patients have been taking anti-tubercular drugs for 2 years, 3 years altogether. So there, the dictum which I follow is that I rely more on CT there, because if there are calcifications and gliosis, then probably it's just the tombstone of the granuloma and not the active tuberculosis. But again, this is a gray zone, and there might be mixed opinions on that.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is for Professor Modi, sir. Sir, suppose a patient is on ATT for tubercular meningitis and the patient is deteriorating. Is there any way distinguishing or a time when we can consider it a treatment failure, or we can find whether it is a paradoxical reaction to the treatment?
It's a difficult situation we face in our day-to-day practice. Normally, if a patient is deteriorating despite starting ATT and steroids, and we are not getting any gene expert which is positive, or we are not getting any clue of rifampicin resistance from any of the investigations, BACTEC is negative, and your cultures are not as yet grown, then probably if the patient is deteriorating and symptoms are not responding, it is better to add the second line drugs pending the results of culture and others, at least to save the life. And these problems come practically. Most of the time, I'll say that even if there is a paradoxical response or there is hydrocephalus, patient does show improvement in many of its symptoms once we start regime of ATT with steroids. But despite that the patient is going down even after 2 weeks, then it is time to reconsider our strategy. And if we are not getting any clue, I strongly favor that at least 2, if not 3, second line drugs should be started till the time we get some other clue from either cultures or some other body part where we can, access, like some lymph node FNAC or some other area which is involved, which can give us some idea about the MDR tuberculosis. But off late we have started, going more aggressive rather than losing the patient in such situations.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is, how frequently do you see tubercular meningitis related LETM presently?
See, there is not much data available in the literature, but in my understanding, many patients of stage 3 TBM at least have associated spinal cord involvement. And in our recent series, we have seen up to 17% of the patients have evidence of myelitis. So it's quite common. The problem is that the patient is unconscious and we are more bothered about his altered sensorium, and it is only during the once patient starts showing signs of recovery that we find out that there is spinal cord involvement. So of late, we have started screening spine in most of the patients of TBM, and we have found that arachnoiditis does cause evidence of there is evidence of cord involvement with arachnoiditis in many of these patients. So I will say almost 1/6 of patients do have associated myelitis, especially in stage 3 TBM. It's quite high.
The next question is, as far as thalidomide is concerned, sir, when should we start it and for how long? What is the indication of starting thalidomide?
Actually, there is no randomized control trials as such to make a generalization. It is just that because we are encountering many patients with lot of complications that despite giving steroids and anti-tubercular therapy, these patients show paradoxical response or has visual involvement, as I showed in one of the cases. And we have many such success stories now where patients with 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months of ATT and steroids are deteriorating, having a power of grade 0 and extensive meningeal enhancement, and there is nothing much to offer them. In those situations, we are trying thalidomide in these patients. But based on this experience of ours, wherever we are doing a follow-up MRI in majority of our patients, at least at 3 months, or earlier if there is a clinical deterioration, and if we find that there is a paradoxical response because patient had already been on steroids and ATT, then we tend to give these patients thalidomide, and we are getting excellent results. Meaning there, rather than facing complications after 4 or 5 months of vision loss or extensive myelitis, if there is a paradoxical response which is worsening on MRI, on follow-up, then it is better to stop it rather than have complications. That is what the consensus is evolving as we are treating these patients. Now, the world literature, you will get isolated case reports of 4 or 5 patients here and there where patients have been reversed following introduction of thalidomide. It is only one large randomized trial which was prematurely stopped when they added thalidomide in every patient of TBM. Probably there are a subset of patients where the inflammatory response is robust. The TNF alpha levels are probably going way beyond the required to control the mycobacterium, and they are damaging your own nervous system. So probably we need something to modulate our immune system, which is probably not getting adequately modulated by corticosteroids. That is what the hypothesis is when we are using any of the immunomodulatory drugs. And it being common in India, we are encountering more and many people have their experiences even with cyclophosphamide. Some people in the world literature, they have used infliximab as an anti-TNF alpha to prevent these complications. So everybody has his own set of experiences as regards the use of immunomodulatory drugs here. Same is true for the use of IV methylprednisolone. Many people are comfortable giving pulse IV methylprednisolone whenever they are facing the complications of exaggerated immune response in the setting of tuberculous meningitis. So it is till the time we have a big series or a good randomized trial, it will be very difficult to give a particular place to thalidomide. Was just that we are using it in our institute and in difficult situations which everybody encounter, like increase in Dr. Preeti said, increase in the size of tuberculomas despite being on treatment. No, we tend to give second line ATT, which may not be at times justified. It may be just the exaggerated immune response, and the patients do show a very good recovery to after introducing thalidomide. So we have many such good examples of patients who respond very well after suffering from myelitis, cranial nerve palsies, increase in size of tuberculoma with large mass effects, and patients with vision loss who are responding really well to thalidomide. So we introduce either when the patient is deteriorating or we are seeing it on paradoxical response on imaging, and we start at a dose of 2 milligram per kg body weight. And at times, after 3 months or so, we tend to taper it down to 1 milligram per kg and observe the patient clinically and radiologically. Right.
Sir, last question to you.
Dr.
What is the role of
we need to close
Yes.
the session because it's almost we are much beyond the schedule. Is it do you think that the question can be taken up late, as a response, common response later, or?
Oh, it's okay, sir. That's okay, sir. We can mail the answers later, but
Because
the session
I
is
think we need to close the session now, so you may kindly.
okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for answering the questions. The questions which have not been answered, the answers will be sent via mails. Now I would like to hand over to Dr. Priyanka to continue the proceedings. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Anand. And I would like to thank our speakers and moderators for today's session for providing us with very practical, precise, and to the point presentations and points to remember. And I would also like to thank the audience for being here with us. And I'm very sure that all of us, especially the residents, have gained a lot through today's session. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you again tomorrow.